Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with part 1 of my August wrap-up. So I'm splitting this into 2 parts because I read 22 books in the month of August, and I just could not face editing and captioning that all at once. So here we are. And also I did make my Alchemist career track, so I am pretty excited about that. Also, before I get started, my friend Kazan from Always Doing, last wrap-up, she mentioned that she really liked how I did content warnings in the description box for my wrap-ups, and that's what reminded me that I actually got that idea from my friend Shelby from Read and Find Out. So shout out to her for that as well. I think that is a really great way to do it, because that way if people don't want content warnings, then they don't have to read them. And it also saves time while filming, because I like to talk a lot, as you guys have probably noticed. I started off the month with 2 plays about Artemisia Gentileschi, because that's just something I read now. And the first one was Life Without Instruction by Sally Clark. So I really didn't like this one. So far this is my least favorite thing that I have read about Artemisia. I didn't like how it kind of softened the rapist's character. Like, there's this one scene at the end where he's talking to Artemisia's father, and they kind of had this moment of like, man, we both did bad things, didn't we? And I'm like, yes, but one of you sexually assaulted someone and the other one didn't. So I don't really like how you turned it into this weird, like, semi-comedic bonding moment. There were also a lot of really unnecessary scenes and characters too. Like, I don't really feel like they added to the play, and it kind of took the focus away from Artemisia and her story. On the plus side, I do think Artemisia had a few good lines, and the dialogue overall felt pretty natural and it flowed more smoothly than in some plays I have read. But it just wasn't enough to redeem this play for me. I feel like it completely missed the point of Artemisia's story in a way that was very offensive to me, actually, and I gave it 2 stars. The other play I read was Lapis Blue, Blood Red by Kathy Kaplan. This one I did like more than the last one. I enjoyed how Artemisia's relationship with her father was paralleled with her relationship with her daughter, because this one is actually set in 2 timelines, so leading up to Artemisia's rape, and then many years later when her daughter is an adult and Artemisia is a really renowned painter, and kind of some conflict starts happening between her and her daughter. So like I said, I did like the 2 timelines. I think it put more of a focus on Artemisia's life after her sexual assault, which in a way I liked because it showed that there's more to her than that. And I liked how Artemisia was a very complex character in this. You know, she did some things that were, you know, we wouldn't really agree with, or she was sometimes a very hard person, I think, to live with, and I kind of liked that messiness about her, but that also kind of worked against the play because I feel like the playwright was really trying to make us doubt her testimony in some places, which I really didn't like. Like, she really played up this idea of the ambiguity of the rape trial and of Tassi, her rapist's actions, and I really didn't like that. Honestly, I think there are enough stories and real-life incidents where the women are not believed. I don't think we need to inject that into a story where it wasn't there in the first place. Like, she won her case. I also think the script of this one was a little clunky. Not that it couldn't be a good play, but I think you would need to cast it very carefully in order to not make it sound awkwardly phrased. I like that they took some inspiration from Artemisia's other writings and like some of her letters. I didn't like how, because of the dual timeline and because of the specific scenes that the playwright chose to show, it sort of felt like Artemisia's rape was unimportant. But it also didn't feel like we really got to see her as a success story and really like move past what happened. I feel like she tried to split the difference and it didn't work in either direction. And I gave this play 3 stars. Next, I finished The Atlantis Complex by Owen Colfer. This is the 7th book in the Artemis Fowl series. I will of course link our live show down below for the Artemis Fowl read-along. And I feel like this is pretty known as being like one of the less impressive books in the series. I know a lot of people don't like it, which I totally get. It's very weird and wacky, and it kind of doesn't make sense a lot of times, but I still enjoyed this. For one thing, I have like a very personal connection to this book, which I went into great detail in the live show, so I won't spend too much time on that here. But the short version is it really meant a lot to me. When I read this for the first time, it really meant a lot to me seeing Artemis struggle with something very similar to OCD in a way that I was. And obviously we had different experiences with that, but that was really powerful because that was the first time I had ever seen a character represented who had that, and the fact that it was one of my favorite characters and that it didn't try and portray this thing that was happening to him as being something that wasn't a big deal or that it didn't matter, but at the same time he was able to move past it and he was still smart and still a wonderful character. I really like that. That's one of the reasons I still really enjoy this book. I just think Artemis's character arc throughout the whole series is really good, and seeing the specific things he struggled with in this book meant a lot. And personal reasons aside, I did enjoy this book. It's kind of a fun ride. I really like the humor in it for the most part. And it's kind of a nice break in between the really intense 6th books and 8th books. So with all of that together, I ended up giving The Atlantis Complex 4 stars, even though I acknowledge it's not the most tightly plotted book. Next, I finished Fierce Fairytales by Nikita Gill, Poems and Stories to Stir Your Soul. And this is a poetry collection, poetry and prose poems, I think, that kind of retells different classic stories and fairy tales, and there's also some other poetry that is not based specifically on a particular story. And this is my first Nikita Gale book, and I really enjoyed it. I really love the style that she uses. I love the fact that she incorporates so many fairy tales and old stories. I think some of my favorite poems were actually the ones at the beginning that are more like cosmic feeling. I don't know, like the things she was saying about stardust, those were really beautiful. I think my favorite poems besides those were the ones where she took an original story and she pulled out an element that was already there and kind of expanded on that. Not that I didn't enjoy the ones where she sort of chose a completely different direction, but I especially liked the way that she could pull out something that was already there and turn that into sort of like a natural extension of what that fairy tale would actually mean. The only thing I wasn't as much of a fan of is sometimes it felt like there was a little too much prose feeling in some of the poetry, and I'm still kind of working out what prose poetry exactly means, so maybe that's on me. But there were a few poems where it sort of felt like just like talking, you know, like I couldn't really, like if I hadn't known it was a poem, I might have thought it was just like a slightly whimsical writing style, you know, in a normal story. But other than that, I really enjoyed this and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Moonrise by Sarah Crossan. This is a novel in verse, and we follow our main character Joe, and his brother is on death row, and he finds out that his execution date has been set, so Joe goes to visit him, and this book is about finding out what happened with his conviction, like how this all came to be, and working through some of their really difficult family problems as well. And it's just a story about the death penalty in America, and also about this one family and how this affects people. And this was such a powerful and emotional book. This felt like a novel in verse where it's not so much about individual poems strung together as an overall rhythm and feeling. I'm also really impressed because I think Sarah Crossan is Irish, and the dialogue and the writing, it felt very authentically American. I've noticed a few times before that sometimes when somebody from the UK or from Ireland or from other parts of Europe, when they try and write a very contemporary American voice, it can sometimes sound odd or fake, but this felt very authentic and very natural, and I just really was impressed by that. I think the facts and figures that this book incorporates were just very effective. Like that was one of my favorite parts of the novel, actually. Like some of these statistics about the death penalty in America, and just the look at some of the real numbers and the real problems, like the fact that so many of the death penalty convictions are obtained through less than legal means. The fact that it predominantly affects poor families is another thing that comes up in this book, and the book doesn't really address this specifically, but the fact that by far it is people of color who get the death penalty. And I just think this book handled a lot of really heavy material in a really powerful and sensitive way, even though it does have this very like national view of the death penalty, these very like far-reaching views and like this these statistics. I think that it didn't lose sight of the really personal story, which is I think one of the reasons why this book worked so well, is because we really get to know this family, and it really shows like this kind of microcosm of how the death penalty affects individual people and individual families, and just all of that working together was very, very powerful. The only thing I didn't love quite as much is there is a love story in this book, and it doesn't take over the story, but I do feel like I don't know, I think it would have been stronger as a friendship if it had stayed a friendship, but in a way it's like it kind of makes sense that you're in this really intense situation. I could see how it would make you respond to relationships in a stronger or more quick way than you would if you weren't in this situation, and I give Moonrise 4.5 stars. Next, I finished The Ghost in the Third Row by Bruce Koval. This is the first book in the Nina 1011 series, I think is what it's called. And this is one of my friend Giselle's favorite series, and I really enjoyed this. We follow our main character Nina, or she goes by Nine, and her new best friend Chris, and they're in a play at a local theater, and they come across a ghost, and they're trying to figure out if they're the only ones who can see her and what is going on, why she's there, who the ghost is. I really liked the characters, and I really liked the theater aspect. Sometimes I read books about plays or about working in theater that kind of makes it clear that the author has never worked on a show before, and this one I think, although it wasn't a huge part of the story, it felt pretty true to my experiences, and I really liked that. I actually really enjoyed the theater aspects of this book. I also think this book was surprisingly modern in the way it approached certain things. There's one point where it's talking about a character who you find out has a mental illness, and it was really uncomfortable at first. I was like, oh no, is this going to be one of those, like, you have to keep in mind the time period it was written in? But it ended up being a very thoughtful view of it. There are still things that we wouldn't phrase that way today, but I think it actually like challenged the assumptions people made about this character in a really sensitive and really important way, so I really liked that. The only things I wasn't as much of a fan of is sometimes the writing felt a little inconsistent, and it went a little too far in the like, gosh golly, this is a kid's book, so we have to use weird expressions all the time. And for all I know, that might honestly be how kids this age in this particular region would have talked at the time, but it just felt a little bit unnatural to me. It felt like the author was putting it on a little bit, but other than that, I really enjoyed this and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce. This is a classic children's fantasy, I guess it is, but there's a little bit of time travel in it as well, and I don't usually like time travel, but I really liked the way it was done in this one. And we follow our main character Tom, and he gets sent to stay with his aunt and uncle, and he's not happy about it until he discovers that he can actually get into this beautiful garden that he thinks might actually be from the past. And he starts spending time there, and he befriends a girl named Hattie, and more Tom starts loving his time spent in the garden to the point where he wants to actually stay there forever, and he starts trying to make that happen. And this was just such a beautiful story. I was really blown away by how much I enjoyed this and how emotional it got. For some reason I wasn't expecting that, but this was just a beautiful story. I absolutely loved the humor and the writing and just the really kind of dry wit, and I loved being in Tom's head too. He was such a fun character. He felt like a very believable child, but he was still very mature, and I don't think he felt like too childish, you know? So I really liked him. I really liked Hattie too. I liked a lot of the characters in this book. I loved the setting and the descriptions of the garden. It reminded me a little bit of The Secret Garden, which was never, you know, never a bad thing for me since I love that book. And this was just so beautiful. Like, there are a few scenes in particular that were just so evocative. Like, there's just one scene where Tom and Hattie are skiing on a frozen river at night, and they're just like beneath all of the stars, and there's nobody around, and they can just hear like the wind and the sound that their skis are making on the ice. That was just, it was described so beautifully, and I just love that scene. It's such a small thing, but Philippa Pierce's writing is so good, and her sense of atmosphere and place is so good that it just, like, that was a real standout moment. I was really charmed by this book, but like I said at the beginning, I was also really impressed by how bittersweet it felt, or how well that was done. I just loved this book so much. I initially gave it 4.5 stars, but honestly I can't remember why I took off half a star, so I loved this. Next, I finished The Bird King by G. Willow Wilson. This is a historical fantasy set during the time of the Spanish Inquisition and the last kingdom of Granada, I think. And we follow our main character Fatima, and her best friend Hassan is a map maker, and he has this strange ability, and Fatima realizes that they need to flee because this ability is not going to be looked kindly on by the Spanish Inquisition, and they go on a journey to try and seek this land where they think that they'll be able to escape the Inquisition and be happy. And unfortunately, I really didn't like this book. I feel like pretty much everything about it was not executed very well. The two main characters, Fatima and Hassan, I don't think were well developed. I don't think they were complex at all. You really only know like 1 or 2 traits about them, and that's it. And even those traits were like kind of inconsistent. And these two characters are like carrying the book. So if you don't really like them and really connect with them, you're really not going to enjoy the story, and that's what happened to me. And Fatima and Hassan's friendship or bond is really important in the story too. And unfortunately, I didn't feel like that was well done either. Like, I truly do not understand any reason why these characters cared about each other at all, much less were willing to sacrifice everything for each other at the drop of a hat, which happened multiple times. They were put in situations like that. And I think it'd be one thing if the story was like, well, they were the only people who were kind to them, you know, like, there were circumstantial reasons why these people latched onto each other more than just like personality. I could understand that, but that's not really what the book says. It's like they're trying to convince you that this meeting of the minds, and like they're such good friends because they love and appreciate things in each other that nobody else does. And I just didn't get that feeling at all. Another thing I didn't like about this book is partly my fault because I didn't do enough research about this book. As you could probably tell from the synopsis, there's a lot of traveling in this book, which I tend to hate, and it was even more than I think the synopsis would lead you to believe. Like, so much of this is a road trip, multiple road trips, that were all frustrating, and so that's on me. But I think even like separating my personal feelings about that plot element, I don't think the plot of this was very well done at all. Like, I had heard a lot of reviews that said that the book was good, but the ending was really confusing. I didn't find the ending confusing, I just found it really unsatisfactory. The plot of this was all over the place. Like, they would make decisions or do things or go places that never ended up mattering in like the overall story, so that was really frustrating and slow to read, because it kind of felt like, why should I care about any of this when I know that it's not going to matter in like 10 pages? And as far as the thematic elements of this book, I feel like I think I kind of see what the author was going for, but I think the way she told the story ended up contradicting the positive messages she was trying to send. Like, just the themes and messages of this book were so muddled by the end in a way that I think really worked against the book. And another thing about like the plot and characters, so the plot was like super choppy, and it also felt completely dependent on all of the characters, especially Fatima, making super stupid choices. Like, not even choices, it was like you could kind of see like G. Willow Wilson like behind the scenes like, well, I have no idea how to get them to this next point in the story, so I'll just make them like fall off a mountain for no reason. Like, that actually happens at one point. And I really, really didn't like this. The only thing that I thought was well done with this book was the writing. It was really beautiful and descriptive, but even that, I think it was overdone because there's so much time spent describing scenery that doesn't really matter and telling you exactly what this rock formation looked like. It just really bogged it down, and I gave this book 1.5 stars. I really was disappointed in it. Next, I finished Lovely War by Julie Berry, and I buddy read most of this with my lovely friend Hannah from Snow White Reader, and we both really enjoyed it. I just fell in love with this book. I actually have a full review coming on it because I had too many feelings to just fit into a wrap-up. But this is a historical fiction story with a mythological twist. So the frame story is Aphrodite gets caught having an affair with Ares by her husband Hephaestus, and she sort of gets put on trial, and her way of trying to justify her actions or justify why her job as the goddess of love matters is to tell two interweaving love stories that were set during World War I, or the Great War. And so we follow the human characters as well, Aubrey and Colette and Hazel and James, and I just fell in love with this book so much. The writing was gorgeous, the characters were so well developed, and I love how even the side characters, you got the sense of how rich they were and how they had this life going on in the background. I loved the relationships between the characters, like the romance, but also the friendship and the other people that they crossed paths with. It was just so beautiful. I think the blending of the plot lines was so well handled, and I love that Julie Berry wasn't afraid to talk about some of the other really bad issues going on at the time. Like, Aubrey is Black, and he's in one of the only Black infantry units, I think, for the American forces. So we see him face all this racism and prejudice and hatred, and that's a really important part of his story. But it also doesn't define him. He is this fully realized character who's not just defined by the bad things he's experienced, and I just can't say enough wonderful things about this book. This is one of my favorite books of the year so far, and again, keep your eye out for the review. I obviously gave Lovely War 5 stars. Next, I finished The Grace Year by Kim Liggett. This is an arc, but I think the book has officially come out by this point, and this is sort of an alternate history dystopian kind of book, sort of like a mystery or a horror too. I don't know what this book is, honestly. We follow our main character whose name I cannot even remember. I could not tell you what this girl's name is, but we follow her during the Grace Year, which is this year where every time the girls get to a certain age, I think it's like 16, they have this thing called the Grace Year, where it's like their magic comes into being and they can lure grown men from their beds, and there's a lot of sexism and misogyny, basically. That's what this book is handling, and they all get sent off by themselves in this campground sort of area, and they have a year to like kind of get the magic out of their system, and then they come back and they're like docile, ready to be housewives and everything. So I really didn't like this book. I thought the setting was really vague and confusing, and the time period too is like very odd. I have no idea what we're supposed to think the setting for this book is, and I don't know if the author was trying to go for like a timeless sort of feel, but it just felt inconsistent because it felt very like old-fashioned, but then they would have things like lithographs and things that seemed like more modern than you were supposed to think the time period was, so I don't know what was going on there. Also, the characters were awful. Like, I really didn't connect to any of them. I didn't like any of them. This is one of the worst romances I think I've read this year. It was so cringy and so bad, and like the love interest, it's like he does some really, really terrible things, and then it's like I just missed the part where we redeemed him. I think we're supposed to feel like he was redeemed because it's like, oh, well, he had reasons for doing these terrible things, and I'm like, yeah, still awful, still a murderer. I just don't understand why we were supposed to be on board for this. And there's this one chunk in the middle of the book that's like all romance, and I hated that so much. And speaking of characters, the main character herself, like I said, I can't even remember her name. She was just completely flat. She really just felt like a stand-in for like a way to tell this story. And I don't think the story was strong enough to support that, because sometimes if a book has a really powerful concept, I can be okay with a character who's sort of just taking you through the story. Even though I am a very character-focused reader, I can be okay with that. And this book, I don't think that happened. I also think for a book that is supposed to be kind of a, not thriller exactly, but there's like this mystery going on, like what is happening with these girls? Do they really have magic, or do they just think they have magic? Like all this stuff going on. This was a very predictable book. There were so many things I saw coming, and one of them is like, maybe this is a function of my particular school that I went to, but if you learned anything at all about the Salem witch trials in the United States, you probably can figure out one or two really big plot elements in this book. So that was also weird, but even setting aside that, just a lot of things were very, very predictable. On the plus side of things, I do think that every once in a while there would be a realization or a moment that was very profound, that did have something really powerful to say about the way that women are treated, about sexism and misogyny and the things that women have to face in the world. So there were some really profound moments like that, but they were pretty few and far between compared to all the stuff I didn't like. I do think the writing was like pretty good, and the ending was just wild. I don't know how I feel about it, because there were some things I think were done well that were really interesting, and it certainly was surprising, so I give the author points for that, but it was also just very frustrating, and like I don't feel like it was satisfying, and I gave it 2.5 stars. Next, I finished The 12 Dancing Princesses by Mariana Meyer, illustrated by K.Y. Craft, and as you can see, this is a picture book telling the story of the 12 Dancing Princesses. I don't think I had ever read the original, maybe, although I like retellings of it, and I really enjoyed this. There's not a lot to say, really. It was well told, the illustrations were beautiful, and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Soul of the Sword by Julie Kagawa. This is the second book in the Shadow of the Fox series, and this was a buddy read with my lovely friend Yvette from Book Cave. As always, all the people I mentioned will be linked in the description. I really enjoyed this. I loved Shadow of the Fox when I read it earlier this year, and I still really enjoyed this one. I think overall, I didn't like it quite as much as Shadow of the Fox, but I do think it's a really strong sequel, and I actually think the ending of this book was even better than the ending of Shadow of the Fox. I love the characters and the relationships in this book, like kind of the squad of friends and allies that we have is just so wonderful to follow, and I feel like this series is a really good example of how like tropes are not a bad thing, because a lot of the characters are pretty familiar fantasy archetypes, but they're done in such a fun and interesting way that I don't mind. I still love Yumiko and the other characters and the world of this book, of this fantasy world. I'm just really enjoying that, and specifically for Yumiko, I really love her character development. I feel like she's coming really far while still retaining the traits that I thought were so endearing or interesting about her in the first book. She's really coming into her own, and I love that, as well as other characters developing too. There's a male-male romance in this book, which I was not expecting, and that was really beautifully developed. And really the only things that I wasn't as much of a fan of with this book is that the pace was a little slower. I know a lot of people said the beginning of Shadow of the Fox was kind of a slow setup, which I can understand, but I actually feel like this one is the book where I felt the story took a little bit to get started. And then the multiple perspectives, I loved most of the ones we got. There was one that I didn't enjoy whenever we had, but I recognized that they were important. It just like wasn't as interesting to read from their point of view, but I still really enjoyed this, and I gave Soul of the Sword 4 stars. Okay everybody, so that is the first half of my wrap up. Stay tuned for part 2. Let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, and I will see you guys soon with another video, which will probably be part 2 of this wrap up. And I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!